Welcome to Republican Roundtable. I'm Max Reimer, your host. With less than 2 months to go until the November election, it's really heating up in Minnesota. Today we have another candidate with us. He rode a blazing saddle. He wore a shining star. His job to offer battle to bad men near and far. We have Jason Lewis, representative of the 2nd Congressional District, running for his second term. Thank you so much for joining us,
Max,
sir.
thank you. Frankie Lane would be proud of you remembering those lyrics after all these years.
I listened to enough radio to have it memorized, and in fact, I think I even had the phone number memorized.
People don't remember what a superstar Frankie Lane was. He was actually an icon to the Beatles, to a lot of rock and roll stars. He was the guy that sang the theme song to Rawhide, to Jezebel. You Gave Me a Mountain, a number of big hits, and he kind of faded. And so when I brought him back for the theme song, people said, God, I like that guy's voice. How do I know that? And they couldn't quite place it.
In Minnesota, you put him on the map again, I would say.
It was
so you are running for your second term in Congress.
Yeah.
In the 2nd Congressional District, where does that cover geographically, just for our watchers at home?
Sure, it's the southern and southeastern suburbs. So you've got Lakeville, Dakota County, Scott County, Shakopee, all the great towns and counties, and then over a little part of Washington, down the river to Wabasha and Goodhue, back over to 35, up and into the Minnesota River. So it's an interesting district. I think it's a microcosm of the state. President Trump won the district by 1 point. He lost the state by 1. I was so popular, I doubled the president's margin in 2016. But it is a competitive district, always has been, and we certainly expect a tough race. But if you look at what we've accomplished in the first term, especially in a macro sense with this roaring economy, we certainly haven't given anybody a reason not to vote for us, and I think we've given a few more folks a reason to vote for us.
Well, speaking to that point, 2016, in some ways it seems like a blur, I'm sure, for you.
Right.
In other ways, it's like, whoa, a lot has gotten done in 2 years. What do you kind of perceive about your own race that's changed from 2016 to this time around? Well,
the first re-elect is always difficult. You remember in 1980, the Reagan Revolution, I think in 1980 there were 33, 34 new House members brought in, and in 1982 about 26 of them lost. So the first re-elect is always difficult. But then there are times like 1998 when you had a president that was being investigated, but the economy was roaring and his party actually gained seats. So nobody knows. If one thing we learned from 2016 is if you've spent 10 minutes reading a poll, you might have wasted 10 minutes.
Right.
So we'll just have to wait and see. But if you take a look at the last 500 days, it's probably the most productive congressional session in a long, long time. If you take a look at what we ran on in 2016, and I can show you op-ed after op-ed, debate after debate, I was talking about a flatter, fair tax code, getting rid of the carve-outs, getting rid of the loopholes, and lowering the rates for the middle class and everyone else, and then getting the economy jump-started by reinvigorating incentives, getting the animal spirits and labor and capital ready to go. And boy, oh boy, we're not growing at 1.9% anymore. Right. We're not growing at 2.6%. We're growing at 4.5%, maybe 4.7% according to the Atlanta Fed. The after-tax wage hikes have gone up about 6%. So if you take a look at the growing economy, and then the fact people are taking home more pay because of the tax cuts, they've seen a big boost in their paychecks. That obviously is what we wanted to accomplish in 2016 when we were elected, and we've gotten it done.
The media would have you believe that nothing you just said matters whatsoever. This seems to be an indictment on Donald Trump. At least that's what we're led to believe. I'm wondering, Jason, we've seen the attack ads. The TV ads are already in full force, it seems. Do you see that being a problem for you this time around, a bigger problem than maybe it was in 2016?
Well, I don't think the attack ads are, Max. I mean, if you take a look at 2016 when outside groups, big money, I get a kick out of Democrats talking about money in politics, then they set record after record after record for fundraising. So in 2016, you had outside groups plus my very wealthy opponent who spent collectively $7-8 million rewriting my broadcast career. And so from the attack perspective, but when you've got all 4 major networks on the broadcast side, on over-the-air side, and all of the cable stations, save for perhaps one, and sometimes they're even critical, when you've got the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Star Tribune, when you've got those people not operating as journalists, but operating as the opposition arm for the Democrat Party, of course it's going to be tougher. They can get their message out, and we've got a harder job of getting, quite frankly, the truth out. But the voters are smarter than that, and it's always gratifying to see the truth prevail. There is a very, very uneasy environment out there right now with a group of individuals, and it's certainly not the JFK or the Harry Truman or even the Scoop Jackson Democrats, but it's the radical wing of the Democrat Party that now believes they're entitled to be a permanent ruling class.
Right.
And if someone takes that away from them, by God, they're not going to let that happen. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a bureaucracy inside Washington trying to undo the will of the people and basically overturn an election, or you're talking about people protesting on private property, crashing town halls, threatening politicians and their families. There is something I haven't seen since the 1960s going on. And I hope the American people are looking at that and saying, do we really trust those people with power?
Yeah. You experienced that personally with people actually showing up on your doorstep. You weren't there, but obviously your neighbors were disturbed, and I think it's a disturbing trend as well in politics. How do you, you are the person they are protesting, period.
Yeah.
Does that type of rhetoric or threat of violence or anything along those lines, does it deter you? Does it discourage you? How do you react to that as the representative?
Yeah, sure. Having been in the public eye for a couple of decades, I'm accustomed to some of the nonsense. And so it doesn't bother me. But my staff, my family, my neighbors didn't sign up for this. Mm-hmm. And it does bother me that they get involved. In fact, the day last summer, not this summer, but the summer before, that 25, 30 people showed up on my doorstep, on my yard, on my home. The neighbors' kids were so worried they called their dad. And they said, hey, we don't know what's going on. And literally, I live in a suburban neighborhood like anybody else, and our houses are right next to each other. And so their dad called me and said, look, they've got something going on at your house. And we took care of it. That is just uncalled for. And I think it represents sort of this collective temper tantrum we're seeing on the hard left.
Right. That,
again, look at Judge Kavanaugh. I mean, look at the most, quite frankly, outrageous and embarrassing spectacle we've seen in confirming a Supreme Court nominee since Clarence Thomas. And you hope the cooler heads among us, and I think that's the majority of citizens in the 2nd District, will look at this and say, all right, this is not the way democracy should operate, not the way a constitutional republic should operate, and these people are out of line, which they are. And indeed, again, the question is, okay, if you're willing to do and say and engage in almost any tactic to attain power, mm-hmm. are you really the one that should have it?
You know, you being an observer of politics prior to you actually being in the realm of politics, I'm interested because we are kind of ground zero. I would say the 2nd Congressional District and the 3rd Congressional District are ground zero for this type of behavior. As an observer of politics, Jason, where do we go from here? Because tax cuts were supposed to kill us. Saving us from North Korea was supposed to kill us. And I'm just curious let's say we hold the House, or we increase our lead in the House and we increase our lead in the Senate, and then we have all the more power to get these agenda items accomplished. With every agenda item, it seems like it gets ratcheted up, the intensity of the protest even more. Where does it end?
Well,
we want to be successful.
It is a testament to our effectiveness. These people wouldn't be doing what they're doing had we not been the first Congress and administration to reform the tax code in over 3 decades. Had we not undone through 16 Congressional Review Acts about $3.7 billion of onerous regulation. The day James Comey testified is the day we repealed Dodd-Frank in the House. Mm-hmm. We are getting back to the notion that a Constitution ought to be a separation of powers document that divides power between the branches of government and the states and the federal government. It ought not be the piece of paper that consolidates power in an unelected court. And that's what Judge Kavanaugh stands for. I believe in the architecture of a republic, the division of power horizontally and vertically, and let the people choose and live under the laws they create. That is the essential architecture of our republic. And Judge Kavanaugh is expressing that. They don't like that because they can't get what they want done, which in many cases is very unpopular, unless they control the court, unless they can control Washington and consolidate power. So all of those things that we've been able to do has put these people in a little bit of a bad mood, shall we say. So it is a testament to our effectiveness. The real downside of all of this, Max, is the politics of personality has taken stage front and center instead of the politics of substance or policy.
Right.
So we can try to talk about, well, are we better off with a flatter, fairer tax code with fewer loopholes, or do you like a really high rate tax code, but then if you're a special interest lobbyist, you get a loophole?
Right.
Now, let's have that debate. Let's have the debate over the waters of the U.S. rule and whether the federal government can regulate a farmer's pond in the springtime and call it an interstate navigable waterway. I don't think they can under the Interstate Commerce Clause, but maybe you do. Let's have that debate. Instead, it's Donald Trump's a bad person. Congress are bad people.
Yeah.
This is and the media, especially cable television and the Washington Post and the New York Times, play along with this. And so it's all about drama. It's all about controversy. It's all about scandal. Anything you can drum up except policy.
Right. You checked off some agenda items, as you made mention of, between 2016 and right now. I'm wondering, on this campaign, has there been any kind of staple issue that's changed for you that you're talking to people with at the door or what have you?
You know, it's funny you should bring that up. Actually, energy has been sort of the surprise issue. Again, we ran in 2016 on getting the economy going again, restoring some sort of semblance of our constitutional republic, making certain that our civil liberties remain intact from things like warrantless wiretaps and FISA courts and things like that. And we've been very successful.
Thank you, by the way.
Well, I voted against FISA, and now we're being proven right.
Yeah.
I'm very happy to do that. But what's happened is we've seen this energy renaissance, this manufacturing renaissance, not only in the 8th District in Minnesota, but of course with natural gas fracking in the Dakotas and energy coming from Canada via pipeline. Mm-hmm. Well, it just so happens that the state's largest refinery is in the 2nd District, the Pine Bend Refinery in Rosemont. They get all of their crude via pipeline. The Enbridge pipeline, which is a 1960s dilapidated pipeline, not efficient at all, is hampering their ability to create more jobs and all of the things they produce at Pine Bend. It's not just jet fuel, and they produce about 88% of the jet fuel at MSP, but it's asphalt, it's cosmetics, it's rubber, you name it. They're doing it very inefficiently because the pipeline holds them back. They are all in for Enbridge pipeline, as am I. My opponent has to answer to the Sierra Club. My opponent has to answer to the Environmental Defense Fund. She has to answer to the swamp. Mm-hmm. And the swamp says you can't support the pipeline. So here you have a Democrat saying, I don't care about 2, 3, 4,000, if you include all the derivative jobs, it could be that many, at Pine Bend. I don't care about that. I've got to do the bidding of the California environmentalists.
Yep.
And that issue has sort of sprung up on us, and we've been, quite frankly, pounding the drum on that because it's good policy and good politics. I'll give you another one. We've got interim nuclear storage in Red Wing at Prairie Island. The Prairie Island Indian tribe is a group of folks that represent the closest population to an interim nuclear storage facility in the country. We've been paying in extra rates for our utility bills for 40 years to get a permanent repository done. First it was going to be New Mexico, and now it's Yucca Mountain, and we're this close. Sierra Club doesn't want a permanent repository. Where's my opponent? Oh, I have no comment on that. We're out there. We co-sponsored the Shimkus bill to build that thing in Yucca Mountain. Red Wing needs it. Xcel Energy needs it. And of course, Prairie Island, the tribe needs it. So, you know, who's representing the district here and who isn't?
That's right.
And that's really what the voters have to look at.
And it gets back to that kind of really far left radical activist. It almost seems like it's actually unfortunate for a lot of these Democrats who may be on one side or the other of an issue, good for us, that you can't tell the truth about who you are or what you believe because you are beholden to this extreme left, and it's getting more and more extreme every day, it seems.
Well, I mean, even her opponent in the DFL endorsement had called her out for just being a big money Hillary Clinton of Minnesota type candidate. And we're seeing that. My opponent runs on getting money out of politics and Citizens United, and then sets record after record after record in fundraising totals, lacks transparency by getting their money from something called Act Blue, and believe it or not, got $150,000, actually more than $150,000 from one industry, one corporate industry. And she's bemoaning the fact that other people are donating to my campaign. I mean, my goodness, the hypocrisy level here is almost deafening. And that gets out, but it's tougher to get out when they have messengers that in the press that will do their bidding.
No doubt. Your first term in Congress, I'm curious as to what the expectation was versus what the reality is. What are some things that you've learned being in D.C.?
Well, the first thing you learn after being in Congress for a little while is I never want to be a part of leadership. I mean, that is like herding cats. When you've got this faction in the Republican caucus and this faction in the Republican caucus, and we finally got them together to reform health care, and then the Senate kind of threw us under the bus on that one. So the leadership task is much more difficult than people realize. But and it does, and this is really important actually from the inside baseball perspective. People shouldn't blame leadership. I don't care who it is, whether it was, pick your favorite leader. Don't blame leadership because leadership is elected by the caucus. Mm-hmm. So what leadership is not going to say, well, let's go here when the majority of the House Republican caucus wants to go here. They don't get elected. So if you've got an issue with leadership, you've got an issue with the caucus. That's one thing. The other thing I learned is how quickly you can get involved and have an impact if you are diligent, if you do your homework, and you're a serious person. Now, it's like a lot of jobs, you know, you can skate by if you want, I suppose. I was never interested in doing that. So I got to Washington, got to work, and leadership did incorporate me in floor debates on health care reform, in floor debates on omnibus bills, in floor debates on the tax cut bill. And indeed, I was fortunate enough to have my language included in the Perkins reauthorization CTE bill. Career and technical education is where it's at right now. Mm-hmm. We've got to start training people to operate computerized lathes, to be plumbers, millwrights, you name it. We don't need too many more four-year liberal arts degrees. Right. Now, it's great for some people. It ought to be an option for people, but that's not what the market is calling for. So we reauthorized and the president signed the Perkins reauthorization, which is the career and technical education. And I had a language in there in an amendment that was included because I went, made the case to leadership, made the case on the floor, and it was marked up with my language in there and survived, and now the dual enrollment amendment is law. Mm-hmm. So you can have an impact working on juvenile justice and criminal justice, as we talked about earlier, and certainly was instrumental in drafting some other pieces of legislation. And so if indeed you're serious about it, your vote out of 435 in the House, it doesn't matter whether you've been there 2 years or 22.
Right.
It's still a vote.
Right.
So you got to go, make your case, and prove to people you're serious, and you can be a player right from the get-go.
You touched on criminal justice reform, and I think this is a good thing for our audience to hear, because so often as Republicans, we're given this false choice of defending law enforcement and the thin blue line and then actually reforming our system of justice. And both of those things are treated as dog whistles to one crowd or the other. What have you taken on and what have you spearheaded in Congress on that issue specifically?
This, for me, is a constitutional issue and a 10th Amendment issue. If you look at the architecture of the Constitution again, the criminal code basically is a province of the states. When two people of the same state have a dispute or there's a crime committed, people are prosecuted by the local district attorney. And if it's a capital crime, it'll be the state of Minnesota or the state of California. And the reason is the founders didn't want a federal police force, a nationalized police force, and a federal criminal code. Now, there are bankruptcy provisions that are interstate and national in nature. There are interstate crimes that are, but the Constitution essentially mentions 3 crimes. There are 4,500 federal criminal statutes. So I've been long an advocate of reining in this rather capricious and vague criminal code, which, by the way, we are starting to find out that almost anybody can be entrapped in. Mm-hmm. And what happens when the law becomes so capricious and so voluminous that then it becomes who they want to prosecute, because at any given day, anybody could be in violation. There was a book not long ago by a conservative scholar that talked about 3 felonies a day, and he did a quick calculation, and those were the number of federal crimes that the average person commits. So I got together with a liberal, believe it or not, Bobby Scott of Virginia, and we brought in Families Against Mandatory Minimums, the NAACP, and the American Conservative Union, and Freedom Works. Okay. And they are all supporting the bill.
Imagine those bedfellows.
Now, for different reasons, I just gave you mine. And we're getting awfully close to the first step on juvenile justice with the bill. But this is something that is very, very important, because once you know, there's an old line about the law being an ass. The proliferation of law is just as dangerous. Mm-hmm. Another particular pundit once said, anarchy is not the absence of law, it is the proliferation of law. So we have to make certain that we support law enforcement. which I do, and we know the people who aren't supporting law enforcement, who want to abolish ICE, who think that sanctuary cities is the way to go, or sanctuary states, or who are protesting out at the state fair with horrible slogans about law enforcement. I married into a police family. My wife was a former policewoman. Her father was a 30-year vet. I know the troubles they face. What law enforcement is looking for is not more laws they can use or not more federal help.
Right.
What they're looking for is to be backed up when they have to make a split-second decision on the street in the middle of the night. That's what they're looking for, and we're doing that. But that doesn't mean we're going to hand over to the federal government the ability to prosecute someone in Shakopee for what they feel is an environmental crime or anything else. It's gotten out of hand.
Yeah, and beyond that, we had a conversation about asset forfeiture several months ago, and I am so disturbed by the trend that sets in and of itself, and how it originated even. The jurisprudence of all of that is just totally backwards.
And in addition to the criminal justice aspect, I've also co-sponsored a bill to reinstate Fifth Amendment and property rights, the Fifth and 14th Amendment property rights. And I tell you the jurisprudence of that, how it got there, and it's bizarre. And it's got this false dichotomy between political rights and property rights. There is no difference between political rights and property rights. Property is a political right.
Right.
The ability to keep what you earn and then purchase something and own that is a political right as much as the First Amendment right, and it's codified in the Fifth Amendment. No life, liberty, or property shall not be taken without due process of law. So how is it that if you're an Uber driver and somebody in the back seat happens to be a drug dealer and you give them a ride, they can take your car?
Right.
Well, here's how the jurisprudence went down as well. You're facilitating a crime and we're impounding the car, but since the property has no due process rights, we can just take it. But it's not the property that has rights, it's the person. And so it is a huge problem, and it's, again, part and parcel of what we're trying to reform in Washington, D.C. And, of course, the cost of it. I mean, if you take a look, since 1980, the incarceration rate has gone up over 500% at the federal level. The cost of that has gone up almost 600%. It becomes very, very expensive to house first-time nonviolent offenders. So there's got to be a better way.
You'd made mention of that's one issue you're tackling. An issue that you talk quite a bit about, both in your career on radio and then on the campaign trail, is you're a deficit hawk.
Yep.
I'm very interested, maybe a little bit disturbed by the recent news that our deficit is still pretty darn high. I'm curious as to what you might be doing about that in Congress. Or
I'm the senior freshman on the budget, so I serve on transportation.
Senior freshman, huh?
Senior freshman. That means I get to have the first crack at the questions.
Okay.
You go to transportation and infrastructure and you see all these great projects you're going to do. You go to ed and workforce and you see, we're going to help educate people. Then you have to sober up and go to the budget committee. And there you see the 30,000-foot view of the dire straits we are in. And we are in very, very dire straits. Consider this, Max. The average post-World War II 10-year Treasury is 5.7%. We've been artificially low at 2.8, 2.9, 3%. If that ever went back to 5.7%, i.e. if interest rates went back to their norms, interest on the federal debt wouldn't be $250 billion, wouldn't be $300 billion or $400 billion, it'd be over $1 trillion. It'd be as much as domestic discretionary spending. We'd have a sovereign debt crisis. Wow. There may be a flea on the dollar. Now, it does become very, very professorial, if you will, when you get into these economic debates, because often, especially if you're talking to a liberal Democrat, you have to sort of educate them first. But there are two kinds of deficits. There's a transitory deficit from a tax cut designed to stimulate the economy and grow revenue. And I'll give you a perfect example of that. Revenues in FY 2018 are higher at lower rates than they were in 2017 at higher rates. Now, that doesn't mean and here's the problem that the left has, well, if they're higher today at lower rates, if we just would have kept those 2017 rates, why, they would have been even higher. Except they wouldn't have been, because the economy wouldn't be growing at 4.5%. Every 1% increase in GDP growth over 10 years elicits about $3 trillion in more revenue. Think about this for a moment. If you are operating a coffee shop or a hardware store and you've got product that isn't moving, and these, don't get me wrong, these mugs are great, but let's just say they're not selling. And let's say that you've got a price tag of $5 on them. I've got an inventory of these mugs, I don't know what to do with. Do you raise the price? You lower the price.
Right.
If you want more work savings and investment, you don't raise the price on it by raising capital gains, raising income taxes, you lower them and you get more of it, albeit a broader base at a lower rate. So At times, and it happened in the 60s, happened in the 20s, in the 60s, and the 80s, initially you get a deficit, a transitory deficit as you're moving to a growing economy. Then you grow out of it and you start to collect more revenue than you did before.
Right.
So that's a temporary deficit. That deficit is designed to spur growth and get more revenue in the long run. The deficits we're dealing with are not tax cut deficits. They are spending deficits. And the spending deficit is the one you have to look out for. Because think about this for a second. Let's say you've got a deficit of $1 trillion. If all you do is raise taxes $1 trillion, you're still crowding out the private sector.
Of course.
All you're doing
Yes.
is taking their money instead of borrowing it.
Right.
You're still crowding out and driving up interest rates. So the Keynesian notion that taxes crowd out consumption and borrowing crowds out savings is just wrong. Taxes, especially the top rate, crowd out savings just like deficits do. So the only responsible way to cut the deficit is to cut spending, which is why I voted against the FY17 omnibus bill and the FY18 omnibus bill, which was that $1.3 trillion, 2,000-page blockbuster. So I'm trying to hold the line on spending and cut taxes to grow the economy to solve the deficit. And that, in the final solution, is the only way that will increase family incomes.
Representative Lewis, for some of our folks at home, this might be the first time, it might be the last time that they hear you before they have the opportunity to go and vote November 6th. What is your pitch to voters in 2018?
Yeah. Pitch to voters is, if you like more after-tax take-home pay, if you like a growing economy with more options, if you like your utility bills actually coming down, which they have because of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, if you like more job openings than job seekers, if you like wage hikes and bonuses, keep it going, because if the House changes hands, that's done. In fact, if the House changes hands, not only will the tax cuts be rescinded and the economy stop, you won't be talking about Obamacare. You'll be talking about socialized medicine, Medicare for all, the $32 trillion scheme that will eliminate employer-based care, VA care, and even eliminate Medicare as we know it. That's what the Democrats will do. You will be talking about abolishing ICE, sanctuary cities, and borders wide open. And finally, you'll be talking about a government that grinds to a halt. If Nancy Pelosi becomes Speaker, and Maxine Waters is chair of the Financial Services Committee, and Adam Schiff is chair of the Intel Committee.
I'm sorry, it's overwhelming right now.
the country grinds to a halt. And the administration over, the revolution is over, the swamp wins. So this is our chance at saying, we got a good thing going, we took the tough votes, we're here to make a difference, let's keep it going. The stakes are extremely high in 2018.
So to finish up, two-pronged question. One, how can people learn a little bit more about the campaign? And two, what do you need help with between now and November?
Yeah. Well, you can go to Jason for MN. Just Jason, FORMN. And there's plenty of things to do there. We need phone banks. We need people to do lit drops. We need door knockers. We need money. We need it all. Because we're in a very, very tough race, and our opponent is getting funded by Nancy Pelosi, by Tom Steyer, by the Environmental Defense Fund, by the usual suspects, and they got a boatload of money. So it's a real challenge. I believe that as the 2nd District goes, the country goes. This is one of those seats that's called a majority maker. It's one of those swing, which, by the way, is why the DCCC has targeted the seat. They've targeted my race because they know if the 2nd goes, they probably win the House. So that's what's at stake. And by the way, for people that think, well, it really doesn't make any difference. For over 2 decades, we've been bemoaning the Met Council. You're looking at a guy that finally decided to take on the Met Council. We've got an amendment that would finally force Met Council reform by making them become federally compliant. The only metropolitan planning organization in the country without one elected board member. Well, they're out of federal compliance. So if you want to get things done, you want a smaller, more accountable government, constitutional government, and a growing economy. I'm your guy, but it's not a cakewalk in 2018. We need your help.
Representative Jason Lewis, thank you so much for joining the Republican Roundtable.
Max, thank you. You bet.
This has been the Republican Roundtable. I'm Max Reimer. Until next time.